They say the Colosseum sounded like a thunderstorm when the games were good. 50,000 voices crashing together, rattling marble, drowning out the screams on the sand. Up here on the benches, pressed shoulder to shoulder in the sun, you felt that roar vibrate in your ribs. You came today to feel it again, to lose yourself in it, but right now it's wrong. Too thin, too quiet. Your one face in a sea of tunics and togas, dust in your throat, the smell of old blood baked into the stone. Below you, today's match could not be more predictable. On one side, a star of the arena, a man whose name you've shouted until your voice broke. On the other, a condemned prisoner in mismatched armor, breathing too fast, shield shaking in his hands. This isn't a contest, it's a sentence. From the first clash, you can see it. The prisoner is just trying not to die. The gladiator is performing. Each feint, each shove, each cut is measured to draw this out. The crowd laughs when the prisoner stumbles, when he slips in someone else's blood and lands hard on his knees. You laugh too at first. This is what you paid for. Fear, danger, relief that it's not you. Then it happens. A sharp exchange. Steel on steel. The gladiator steps inside the prisoner's guard and drives his blade down into the man's thigh. The sound is ugly, a wet crack that cuts through the noise. The prisoner collapses, shrieking, his leg twisted, bone pierced. This is the moment you've seen 100 times. The point of the sword, the appeal to the emperor, the gesture that decides mercy or death. Only the sword doesn't rise. The gladiator doesn't look up at the imperial box. He doesn't even glance at the crowd. Instead, he circles behind the fallen man and plants his heel between the prisoner's shoulders, pressing him into the sand. The screams shift register, ragged, panicked. Around you, the laughter falters. Slowly, deliberately, he grinds his heel into the broken leg. The limb bends in directions it should never go. The prisoner's hands claw trenches into the sand as his body twists into a grotesque angle. He's not being killed. He's being arranged, shaped, turned into something to be looked at. The sound in the amphitheater changes. The roar doesn't come. It shreds into scattered shouts, uneasy murmurs, little pockets of stunned silence. Someone near you hisses through their teeth. Someone else curses under their breath. You realize you're not cheering. You're holding your breath. The gladiator hooks the tip of his sword under the prisoner's chin and forces his contorted body upright, just enough for every tier of seats to see. The man is still alive. That's the point. His agony isn't a byproduct. It's the main attraction. You came for spectacle. You got a lesson. And somewhere inside you, a thought you don't want to look at takes shape. When does a show stop being entertainment and become something else? How far does cruelty have to go before even a Roman crowd, raised on blood, feels horror instead of joy? Before we dive further into the story, make sure to subscribe and leave a comment on where in the world you are watching from today. The man screaming on the sand isn't an accident. He's a product. It's easy to blame the gladiator, to tell yourself that what you just saw in the arena was the result of one cruel mind. One broken man who went too far. That's comforting. It makes the horror containable. But Rome didn't run on individual madness, it ran on systems, and the games were one of its most efficient. You have to start far from the Colosseum, at the edges of the empire where Roman eagles meet someone else's banners. A village in Gaul that resisted too long, a rebel band in Judea, a defeated army on some nameless field in Dacia. The moment the shield wall breaks, the sorting begins. The most valuable prisoners are ransomed. Some are paraded in chains behind a victorious general. The rest are inventory. From there, the pipeline is ruthless and simple. Chained marches to ports or roads, days or weeks walking with iron biting your ankles, half starved, half sick, knowing only that you've moved from enemy to property. In some cases, you're herded into makeshift pens and inspected like livestock. Teeth checked, muscles prodded, scars noted. Not because anyone cares about your pain, but because different bodies suit different uses. Strong young men might go to farms, mines, and building sites. Others are set aside, flagged for a more theatrical fate. Condemned criminals, rebellious slaves, prisoners of war who refuse to submit. There's a category for all of them. The paperwork doesn't say toy for the arena. It says things like ad ludum or ad bestias, to the school, to the beasts. Short phrases that translate to a long, carefully staged death. Sentencing blurs everything. In theory, a criminal is being executed. In practice, the method is chosen with an audience in mind. Did he anger the emperor? Expect something spectacular. Did she defy a moral code? The punishment must be edifying. In a system obsessed with hierarchy, even death has sublevels: quick, slow, dignified, ridiculous. A noble might be allowed a swift, clean end. A rebel slave might be burned, torn apart by animals, or forced into a rigged battle he was never meant to survive. By the time a body reaches the arena floor, it has passed through hands you'll never see. Magistrates, traders, trainers, guards. Each one shaving off another layer of personhood until all that's left is function. Opponent, victim, example. And this is the part that should make your skin crawl. Rome didn't just accept that people died in the games. It designed how they died. It wrote scripts with blood as ink. It decided which deaths should inspire admiration, which should provoke laughter, which should humiliate an entire conquered people watching their countrymen reduced to a punchline. So maybe the question was never simply, why did gladiators kill defeated prisoners? It's darker than that. Why did an empire feel the need to choreograph their suffering so precisely? What kind of society builds a machine where even the way you scream is part of the plan? The arena is where men die. The ludus is where they learn how they're allowed to. Inside the gladiator school, the noise is different from the Colosseum. No roaring crowds, no trumpets, no orchestrated drama, just the slap of wood on flesh, the hiss of sand under sandals, the low grunts of men who know that every mistake here will echo later in front of 50,000 witnesses. You might think of gladiators as mindless killers, bruised animals thrown at each other until someone stops moving. That's the version Rome liked to sell the masses. Raw strength, simple courage, clean endings. But behind the walls of the ludus, everything is more complicated. There's technique, discipline, hierarchy, and above all, there is a code. Trainers drill the same lessons into everyone, whether they arrived as volunteers chasing glory or slaves with no choice at all. Protect the throat, watch the shield side, never turn your back, and beneath the technical instructions, something else is hammered in: how to die. A good death is almost as valuable as a victory. Dying on your feet, weapon in hand, facing the opponent. No begging, no scrambling, no humiliating panic. If you fall and the crowd believes you faced the end with dignity, your name might be spoken again. A patron might honor you. A fellow fighter might nod when your story is retold. A bad death is the opposite. Dropping your weapon and crawling, screaming for mercy, trying to cling to your killer's legs. In a culture that worships control, losing it in front of the stands brands you as something less than a man. The trainers warn you about that too. They don't say it kindly. The crowd plays its part in this code. They expect the victor to perform certain rituals. Step back, raise his weapon, look to the emperor or the editor of the games for the signal. If the fallen man has fought bravely, there's a chance for mercy. If he's disgraced himself, the crowd might demand the final blow. Thumbs, gestures, shouts. It all fuses into a verdict. But codes only work as long as everyone agrees to follow them. Every so often, a gladiator decides the script isn't enough. He doesn't step back. He doesn't ask. He walks closer to the man on the ground and does something the trainers never taught. He takes his time. Maybe he toys with his victim, tapping the blade against exposed skin, opening shallow cuts just to hear the change in the screams. Maybe he pins the defeated man, forcing him into a degrading pose before the kill. Maybe he waits, making the crowd sit with discomfort, stretching seconds into an eternity. There are stories, whispers passed between wine stalls and bathhouses, of crowds that turned ugly at moments like that. Of booze and thrown food, not because someone died, but because the dying took on a flavor the audience hadn't agreed to stomach. Of emperors leaning forward, suddenly very interested, deciding whether this particular display was genius or an insult to the Roman sense of measure. You know the image, the hand raised, thumb poised, deciding fate. But what if the real horror of the games wasn't the moment the verdict was given? What if it was everything the victor chose to do after he already knew how the story was supposed to end? They don't tell you which hour will be yours. Time in the cells beneath the arena is a smear of darkness and stale air, broken only by the footsteps of guards and the muffled thunder from above. You learn to read the games by vibration. The sharp, sudden shudder of a chariot crash, the drawn-out rumble of animal hunts, the jagged, almost frantic tremor when men are fighting. You were not sent here to be trained. No wooden sword, no patient instructor, no drills in the yard. You arrived in chains after a verdict that was half sentence, half shrug. Enemy, rebel, criminal. It doesn't really matter which word they used. The scribes wrote a few lines on a wax tablet, and you disappeared into the category that feeds the arena. When the bolt slams back on the door of your cell, your body reacts before your mind does. The others pressed in around you, gaunt faces, sunken eyes, pull away slightly, as if what's coming might be contagious. Two guards gesture. You stand. Your legs feel hollow. The corridor smells of iron and animal musk. Torches spit and hiss as you're led along, past other doors, other breaths caught in other throats. There are marks scratched into the walls here. Names, half-finished prayers, tally lines. None of them reach the end they were asking for. Then the corridor widens. You hear it, the crowd. Not the muffled hum you've lived with for days, but the raw, open roar of 50,000 throats. A gate creaks somewhere ahead, the sound of wood and metal dragged upward. Light pours in like a physical blow. The sand is brighter than you imagined. Hotter, too, radiating the noon sun back into your face. You stumble as your eyes adjust and feel a shove between your shoulders. The crowd notices you as a single organism, a ripple of interest, not yet excitement. You're not why they came. You're part of the scenery. Your opponent crosses the sand toward you, and the contrast is obscene. He moves with the easy balance of someone who spent years turning violence into craft. Polished helmet, scarred arms, the confidence of a man who knows exactly how this ends. You raise your borrowed shield. It's too heavy. Your hand is slick. The first cut is not meant to kill you. His blade kisses your arm, a shallow line that stings more than it bleeds. The crowd approves. They like the warm-up. The second blow takes your shield off balance, spinning it from your grip. Now, you're exactly what they wanted. Disarmed, exposed, useful. He steps in close, presses the flat of his sword against your chest, and with a theatrical shove, sends you sprawling. Laughter rolls down the tears. You're not an enemy anymore. You're a prop. He plants a foot on your back, flexes for the stands, raises his weapon in a triumphant arc that has nothing to do with you and everything to do with them. He could end it now. A quick thrust between ribs, a snapped neck. Instead, he grabs your hair and yanks your head up so your face can be displayed to every tier of seats. You feel the rough edge of his blade trace the line of your ear, your jaw, your throat, not cutting yet, drawing. Sometimes defeat means more than death. Sometimes it means losing parts of yourself first, hands removed to mock a thief, tendons severed to ruin a warrior, a branded symbol burned into flesh so your pain carries a message for anyone who recognizes it. Each cut, each scream, each drop of blood is a letter in a language the crowd has learned to read. For a few of the condemned, the most merciful outcome is a blade they never see coming. For others, the The worst fate is the one that keeps them breathing, limbless, broken, paraded in front of 50,000 eyes as proof of what Rome can do when it wants not just to kill a man, but to turn him into a warning. There were days when the Colosseum wasn't an arena. It was a theater that killed its cast. On those days, the wooden floor wasn't marked out for duels. It was dressed like a stage set for a god's story or a hero's. Painted backdrops, props hauled up from the underbelly of the building, traps prepared. To the crowd, it was a treat, not just another fight, but a show. The condemned felt the difference immediately. Instead of being handed mismatched armor and a dull sword, they might be dressed in costumes that mocked them. Animal skins, rags, cheap imitations of mythic heroes. They were told what role they would play, not with scripts, but with hints. "You are Actaeon," a guard might say, smirking. "Remember how his story ends." Or, "Today you are Orpheus. Try not to lose your head." The cruelty lay in the familiarity. Everyone in the stands knew the myths. They knew that Actaeon was torn apart by his own hounds, that Orpheus was ripped limb from limb, that Prometheus's liver was eaten daily by a bird that never tired. And Rome, inventive as ever, had animals, fire, and blades enough to make those endings real. You can imagine one of these shows. The arena floor transformed into a fake forest. A man dressed like a hunter, antlers strapped to his head, sweat already running down his neck. Gates grind open, and a pack of half-starved dogs pours out, teeth bared. The crowd cheers at first. This is what they came for. But when the animals don't kill quickly, when they tear and worry and drag, when the man's screams stretch far beyond what the story demanded, some of that cheering thins. Or another day, the sands turned into a mock ocean. A fragile wooden raft, a man chained to it, representing some doomed sailor from a well-known tale. Instead of a metaphorical monster, real ones are brought in. Crocodiles, perhaps, or big cats forced into water they hate. The chaos isn't clean or elegant. It's desperate, flailing, ugly. The narrative the organizers planned dissolves into raw panic, and suddenly you have thousands of Romans watching something that looks less like a story and more like a public nightmare. There were burnings, too, bodies tied to posts, pitch poured over skin to imitate the tortures of mythic punishments. There were staged beheadings where the victim was forced to speak lines before the blade fell, turning his last moments into a punchline. On occasion, emperors competed with their predecessors by ordering executions more elaborate, more inventive, more unforgettable than the last. But sometimes, the very excess betrayed them. Ancient writers mention crowds that grew restless, even hostile, when a show went too far. When a prisoner's suffering dragged on so long that the myth was forgotten and only the agony remained. When a comic execution, meant to be funny, landed like a stone in a pond. No laughter, just a fidgeting unease that spread like a stain through the tears. Imagine what it takes to shock people who cheer at decapitations. What line has to be crossed before even Romans, numbed by years of blood, look away? And if there was a point where they finally felt horror, what does that say about everything they had watched, guiltless, right up until the moment they decided it was too much? From the seats, it was easy to pretend you were only watching. Up here, squeezed between a butcher and a moneylender, backs pressed to hot stone, you could tell yourself you were just one more anonymous body in a sea of tunics. The real story was down there, on the sand. Men with swords, men in chains, emperors in shaded boxes. You were background noise, but that noise had power. The first time you came to the games, it was the roar that hooked you, not the sight of blood, not really. It was the feeling of your own voice melting into 50,000 others, until you couldn't pick it out anymore. The moment when the crowd surged to its feet, and you went with it, swept up in a force bigger than anything you'd ever felt. It wasn't just about death. It was about belonging. And woven through that belonging was something darker, relief. Every time a condemned man stumbled out into the sun, you felt it. That quiet, secret thought, it's him, not me. His neck under the blade, his body in the jaws of the animal, his blood soaking into the sand, while you sat safely above, wrapped in heat and noise. Rome had a lot to be anxious about. Plagues, famines, border wars, corrupt officials, but here, for a few hours, the chaos of the world was boiled down to a simple equation. Someone dies. Someone wins. The emperor raises a hand. Order is restored. The games weren't just entertainment. They were a pressure valve. The fear that stalked the streets, the fear of poverty, disgrace, sudden violence, got channeled into ritual violence you could cheer at from a safe distance. Better the stranger in the arena than your child, your neighbor, yourself. So when something on the sand went too far, when a show slipped its leash and became uglier than anyone had planned, the reaction in the stands was complicated. You flinched. Maybe you looked away when the dogs took too long to finish their work, when the fire clung to a screaming body, when a gladiator turned a defeated man into a toy. For a moment, the spell broke, and you saw not a character in a story, but a person, meat, bone, terror. And yet, the next time the trumpet sounded, you were back. So were the others. The same mouths that had fallen silent during the worst of it opened eagerly to cheer the next bout. The same hands that had clenched in discomfort reached for bread, for wine, for the neighbor's shoulder when a favorite fighter entered the arena. Horror and fascination braided together until you couldn't always tell which you were feeling. It's tempting to blame the cruelty on the men with swords, or the officials who planned the shows, or the emperors who demanded bigger, louder, bloodier spectacles. But ask yourself this: would any of it have lasted? Would it have escalated the way it did if the stands had stayed empty? Did the games grow more monstrous because the organizers were inhuman, or because, no matter what they put on the sand, the crowd kept coming back for more? By the time the blood on the sand had dried, the work of changing the story had already begun. The arena ended lives. The writers decided what those lives meant. None of them were neutral. Take the philosophers first. They weren't in the cheap seats. They watched from shaded boxes or heard the details secondhand, then used the games as raw material for arguments about virtue, self-control, and the decay of Roman morals. When they wrote about a prisoner facing death calmly, it became a lesson about stoic courage. When they mentioned cruelty, it was usually to scold the crowd, to point a finger at decadence, not to dwell on the specifics of what was done to a single, nameless body. Then there were the gossip writers and satirists, the ones who lived on scandal. They loved the extremes, emperors who personally swung swords, nobles who demanded outrageous shows, gladiators who became sex symbols. They exaggerated for effect, stretching one grotesque incident into proof that Rome itself had gone mad. In their hands, a tortured prisoner might become a punchline or a horror story, depending on the point they wanted to make. But either way, the details are bent toward entertainment. Later, much later, Christian authors weaponized the arena in a different way. For them, the Colosseum was a theater of martyrdom. Stories of believers torn by beasts or burned as torches were sharpened into spiritual weapons, contrasting pagan cruelty with Christian endurance. Their accounts preserve some of the worst things that were done to defeat prisoners, but even those narratives are curated. The focus is on faith, not always on the full mechanics of suffering. And hovering over all of this is a quieter censorship, the things nobody wanted to write down. If an emperor ordered something so depraved it made even his allies uneasy, it was safer to blame it on excess in vague terms than to spell out exactly what happened. If a show turned the stomachs of an entire crowd, how many witnesses went home and chose never to speak of it again? How many scribes, when faced with accounts that made emperors, organizers, gladiators, and spectators all look complicit, simply decided to summarize the event as spectacula cruenta, bloody shows, and move on. Then the centuries added their own filters. Manuscripts were copied, edited, and lost. Whole works disappeared. Others survived only in fragments or hostile quotations. Modern retellings layered fresh agendas on top. Victorian shock, Hollywood spectacle, our own uneasy fascination. Directors linger on slow-motion sword strokes, perfect CGI tigers, the noble hero facing a corrupt system. The camera rarely stays with the broken, anonymous prisoner long enough to show what being finished off actually meant. So, when you picture the games, what are you really seeing? A sanitized montage assembled from a handful of surviving descriptions, trimmed of their most uncomfortable edges, or a distorted funhouse reflection where the most marketable horrors were amplified while the truly unbearable ones were quietly buried? Which is scarier? That ancient writers embellished the cruelty for effect, or that the worst things the victors did to the defeated were so unspeakable that they never made it onto the page at all? The image we started with is still there, whether you want it or not. A man on the sand, leg broken, body twisted, another man standing over him with a sword and a choice. Around them, 50,000 people caught in that thin, dangerous space between thrill and disgust. It would be easy, comforting even, to stand far above them in your mind and say, I would have walked out. I would have looked away. I wouldn't have gone in the first place. But the uncomfortable truth is that you understand the pull more than you want to admit. You know what it feels like to be part of a crowd, to let your own reactions dissolve into the roar of everyone else's. You've felt the satisfaction of seeing someone who deserved it get humiliated, exposed, punished. Maybe not with swords and lions, but with cameras and comment sections, with mocking edits and viral clips. Our arenas have different architecture now, but the logic hasn't changed as much as we like to think. Look at how we treat public failure, a celebrity breakdown. A criminal perp walks. A stranger caught in some compromising moment on a shaky phone video. We replay it, dissect it, and joke about it. We watch the same few seconds of their worst day over and over, from different angles, with different commentary layered on top. We tell ourselves it's information, it's justice, it's accountability. Maybe sometimes it is, but just as often, it's entertainment built on someone else's suffering. The Romans turned defeat into a system. They choreographed pain into categories: honorable, shameful, spectacular, comic. We've done something similar with reputational death. There are good downfalls, neatly packaged redemption arcs, and there are bad ones, where a person becomes a meme, a warning, a thing. We like to pretend we're more civilized because there's no blood on the sand, but the part of us that leans forward when someone is cornered, trapped, exposed, that part feels very familiar. So yes, what gladiators did to defeated prisoners was horrifying. The broken limbs, the slow executions, the shows that turned men into props still have the power to make us flinch across 2,000 years. But the deeper horror is this. None of it would have mattered without the people in the stands. Without the daily decision, repeated over decades, to show up, to watch, to clap, to demand more. This isn't a story about inhuman monsters safely quarantined in the past. It's a story about how easily ordinary people can turn other people's pain into a spectacle, and how, once an entire society learns to enjoy that, it becomes very hard to remember where the line was in the first place. Somewhere beneath the ruins of the Colosseum. The sand is gone, the blood washed away centuries ago. The stones are cracked, the benches broken, the empire that built it all long vanished. But the questions those games raised didn't die with Rome. What do we do when someone falls? Do we look away, or do we lean forward? Do we ask what brought them to that moment, or do we just enjoy the impact? In every age, in every empire, there are people with swords and people on the sand, and there are always crowds watching, deciding what counts as justice and what passes for entertainment. If there's one thing to take from the gladiators and their defeated prisoners, it's not just how far human cruelty can go. It's how ordinary it can look when everyone agrees it's normal. If you want to keep walking into the darker corners of history with me, into the arenas, throne rooms, and battlefields where these decisions were made, this is only the beginning. Subscribe to Requiem of Thrones and leave a comment on where in the world you are watching from today.